The Buddha once told a story about a hare sitting alone in a forest who heard a single fruit fall and screamed that the earth was breaking apart. Every animal ran. The stampede was real, but its cause was a story, not a fact. A fruit had fallen. That was all. This is how most suffering works. The pain is real. The story built around it is what makes it feel unbearable. Right now, somewhere inside you, a hare is running. You may not know exactly what started it, but the running feels urgent. The ground feels unstable. And peace, genuine, unforced peace, feels like something other people have access to, but you cannot quite reach. The next 3 hours will change that. Not by removing what hurts, by teaching you what the Buddha taught, that most unbearable suffering is not caused by life itself. It is caused by the story the mind builds around life. And a story, unlike a wound, can be seen clearly. When you see it clearly, it loses its grip. These are verified teachings from the Buddha, stories and insights tested across 2,500 years of human pain. Each one is medicine. Each one works. Get comfortable wherever you are. If you can, pull something warm around you and let your body settle. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are listening from right now. And then simply rest. What you are looking for is already inside this next 3 hours. You are a monk in 5th century India. The monastery sits at the edge of a forest in the Ganges plain, where the air before dawn carries the smell of wet earth and distant wood smoke. Your robe is saffron. Your head is shaved. You have walked away from everything the world considers worth having: comfort, family, the quiet certainty of an ordinary life, because you are searching for something more reliable than any of those things. You are searching for peace, and you cannot find it. Not for lack of effort. You sit in the meditation hall for hours each morning, back straight, eyes closed, doing everything exactly as you were taught. But your mind refuses to stay where your body is. It pulls toward the conversation from yesterday with a fellow monk that ended with an edge neither of you acknowledged. It pulls toward the teaching from last week that you still do not fully understand and quietly fear you never will. It drifts forward into some imagined version of yourself, calmer, clearer, finally at ease. You are sitting completely still while your mind runs through a dozen rooms at once, and the gap between where your body rests and where your attention has traveled feels, some mornings, like the whole problem. You begin to wonder if something in you is simply not built for this. If certain people have access to stillness by nature, and you are not one of them. If all this effort is quietly proving something you did not want to know about yourself. One morning your teacher hands you a robe. old, worn thin at the elbows, in need of careful washing. He gestures toward the river without explanation. No wisdom attached to the task, no teaching offered alongside it. Just the robe, the direction, and the instruction to return when it is clean. You carry it to the river. You kneel at the bank. You put your hands into the cold water. Something shifts. Not dramatically, no flood of clarity, no sudden revelation. But your mind, for the first time in longer than you can measure, stops moving towards somewhere else. Because this task requires your full attention right here, right now. The worn patches of cloth need gentleness, or they will tear. The current needs reading, or the robe will be carried downstream. The cold of the water needs to be worked with, not resisted. All of this is happening now. None of it exists in yesterday's unfinished conversation. None of it lives in next year's imagined version of yourself. There is only this cloth, this river, these hands, this single moment. You stay at the river longer than necessary, because something in your body recognizes what your mind has been searching for through all those hours of disciplined sitting. It was here the entire time, not in stillness forced through effort, but in attention so complete it leaves no room for anywhere else. Not past, not future, just this water, this cold, this light, moving across the surface. That monk is named Tissa. His story is preserved in the Dhammapada commentary, a vast collection of teachings and the human lives behind them, compiled in 5th century Sri Lanka by the scholar Buddhist. Tissa was not failing through laziness. He was not careless in his devotion. He was looking for peace in a future version of himself rather than in the moment his hands were already in. When he returned from the river, his teacher looked at him and said quietly, "What you were doing at that river was more important than any plan you have ever made for your future." This is what the Buddha taught about the present moment. Not as a spiritual concept to carry and occasionally recall. Not as a destination earned after years of perfect discipline. As the only address where life is actually taking place. The past no longer exists as anything more than memory. The future does not yet exist as anything more than imagination. What is real, the only thing that is genuinely, undeniably real, is this. Think about what your mind does on an ordinary morning. Before your body has fully arrived in the day, your mind is already inside the meeting that starts in 2 hours. It is replaying the argument from 3 days ago, quietly rehearsing the words you should have chosen. It is somewhere vague and watchful, scanning for whatever might go wrong. Your body is in one location. Your attention is scattered across many others. This is not a personal failing. This is what an untrained mind does by default. It gravitates toward the past or the future because both feel more urgent than the quiet plainness of right now. And in that gap, between where your body is and where your mind has traveled, all the unnecessary suffering quietly takes root. The Buddha was precise about this. A mind wandering into the past finds regret, feelings tied to events that cannot be changed. A mind wandering into the future finds anxiety, feelings tied to events that have not arrived and may never arrive. A mind that stays where the body already is finds something neither of those places can offer. Not the absence of difficulty, not guaranteed comfort, but a quality of aliveness simply not available anywhere else. This teaching is not asking you to love the present moment. It is not asking you to find it beautiful or spiritually significant. It is asking something far simpler. Stop adding to it. Stop loading this moment with the weight of everything that has already happened and everything that might happen next. The moment, stripped of those additions, is lighter than you think. What makes it feel impossible is almost never the moment itself. Most people who are suffering right now are not suffering from what is happening in this exact moment. They are suffering from what happened 6 months ago and has not loosened its hold, or from what might arrive next year and has not yet shown its face. Strip both of those away, the past and the future, and settle inside this single breath. The actual emergency is almost always quieter than expected. This moment, standing alone, is manageable. It is the mind carrying the accumulated weight of every other moment that makes now feel unbearable. Tissa did not find what he needed through more sitting. He found it through cold water, wet cloth, and a task that needed every part of him. Presence is not something you think your way into. It arrives when the gap between your body and your mind finally closes. Closing that gap requires no monastery, no shaved head, no worn robe. It requires noticing when you have left this moment and returning. That single movement, noticing and returning, is the whole practice. Not arriving perfectly, not staying forever, just returning again and again to where your body already is. This can happen anywhere. When you eat slowly enough to actually taste what is in your mouth. When you listen to someone speak without quietly preparing your response while they are still talking. When you feel the temperature of water on your hands instead of solving tomorrow's problems in your head. These are not small consolations. These are the actual doorways. The present moment does not announce itself with fanfare or a feeling of special significance. It simply waits, without urgency, for the mind to arrive. Tissa came back from the river carrying something he had not held in months. Not an answer, not an achievement. A direct experience of what peace feels like when it stops being an idea and becomes something lived. Nothing outside him had changed. The monastery was the same. His unresolved questions were still there. But he had spent an hour with his mind and his hands in the same place at the same time, and that single hour had given him what months of restless, wandering thought could not. Wherever you are right now, whatever surface you are resting on, whatever sounds move through the air around you, whatever the temperature feels like against your skin, this moment is not a waiting room. It is not a bridge towards something more worthy of your attention. It is the place itself, and it has been here the entire time you were somewhere else. Somewhere in ancient India, a king has not eaten in 3 days. He sits beside a body. His queen, the woman they called Ubari, whose name alone was enough to soften a crowded room, died without warning, and the king has decided, in the wordless logic of grief, that he will not let her go. The body lies dressed in her finest clothes. Servants move quietly around the edges of the room, unsure whether to speak. Ministers wait outside the door. The kingdom, for all practical purposes, has paused. And the king sits, holding on. What he is feeling is real. No one looking at that scene could question the reality of his grief. But grief and the refusal to release are two different things, and the king has confused them. He believes that holding on is the same as loving her, that to let her be buried is to let her be erased, that the weight he is carrying is proof of how much she mattered. So he carries it, and the weight grows heavier with every hour, while the kingdom waits, and the body before him becomes something she never was. A wise counselor comes, not to argue with the king's grief, and not to rush him toward a tidier emotional state. He comes with a single question. He asks the king to walk with him, not away from Ubari, but toward her, closer than the king has dared to look in 3 days. They walk to where the earth near her body has begun its quiet work. The counselor points and asks, very gently, "Your Majesty, in her many previous lives, in all the forms she has already passed through before this one, which of these small creatures was she then?" He pauses, and then, and in the lives still ahead of her, which of them will she become next? The king stares. The question does not make sense to him at first, and then, slowly, it makes too much sense. Ubari was not a permanent, fixed thing that had been taken from him. She was a form, a beautiful, beloved, irreplaceable form that life had assembled and was now releasing. As it does, as it always does, with everything and everyone. She had passed through countless forms before this one, and she would pass through others still. What the king was refusing to put down was not Ubari. It was his idea of her, fixed, permanent, belonging to him alone. The story comes from Jataka number 207 in the Pali Canon, a collection of the Buddha's previous lives, recorded in the Theravada tradition. The counselor in the story is the Bodhisattva, the future Buddha, not yet fully awakened, but already carrying the particular kind of wisdom that cuts cleanly through delusion without cruelty. The teaching he offered the king was not about Ubari. It was about the nature of ownership itself, about what we believe we possess and what we believe the loss of that possession says about us. Now consider what you are carrying right now. Not grief necessarily, though perhaps that too, but the other weights. The critical voice of a parent who has been dead for 10 years and still comments on your choices. The judgment of someone who dismissed you casually, perhaps without even realizing, and whose words you have been turning over ever since. The expectations of a family, a culture, a version of the world that decided what you should be before you were old enough to have a preference. The shame that arrived in someone else's anger and somehow became yours to carry home. The disappointment of people you love that has quietly installed itself inside your own chest and now speaks in your own voice. None of that was ever yours. The Buddha's teaching on non-clinging, what the Pali tradition calls anupadana, is usually explained as releasing attachment to things we want. But it works in the other direction too, and this direction is almost never discussed. We also cling to pain that was handed to us by others. We adopt it. We carry it as though it describes something true about us. We let it decide what we deserve, what we are capable of, how much space we are permitted to take up in a room. And we call this being realistic, or being humble, or simply knowing ourselves. What it actually is carrying someone else's robe and mistaking it for your own. Think about where most of the weight in your chest actually comes from. Not from your own clear-eyed assessment of who you are, from the accumulated residue of other people's bad days, unexamined beliefs, and unresolved fears that were expressed in your direction and that you, without being asked, picked up and kept. You were not born doubting yourself in that particular way. Something happened, and someone's words or actions landed in you, and you found a place for them inside your understanding of yourself. You gave them a room, you fed them, and over time they began to feel like residents rather than visitors. The king was doing the same thing with his grief. He had taken the loss, which was real, and added to it an assumption that was not, that holding the body was the same as honoring the person. That releasing her meant losing her, that the weight of his sorrow was the only honest response to how much she had mattered. The counselor did not take his grief away. He simply showed the king which part of what he was carrying was real, and which part was a story the king had built around the real thing, a story that was crushing him while doing nothing whatsoever for Ubari. Releasing what is not yours does not mean pretending it never happened. It does not mean the words were not spoken, or the loss was not real, or the pain did not leave a mark. It means recognizing the difference between the event and the weight you have added to the event by carrying it forward as evidence of something permanent about you. The event happened. It is finished. What you are dragging is the conclusion you drew from it, and that conclusion can be set down. The king eventually walked away from that room. He ate. He grieved properly, which is to say, he let grief move through him, rather than petrifying around it. He did not stop loving Uberi. He stopped believing that the only way to love her was to refuse to let go. There is a weight you have been carrying that was never yours to keep. You absorbed it at some point, perhaps so long ago you no longer remember a time without it. It speaks in your voice now. It feels like self-knowledge. But knowledge of yourself is clear and quiet and specific. What you have been calling self-knowledge is often just an old story handed to you by someone who was themselves in pain that you have been loyal to ever since. You can put it down, not all at once, not without tenderness toward the part of you that picked it up in the first place, usually because carrying it felt safer than questioning it. But you can begin to look at it the way the counselor asked the king to look, closely, honestly, and with a question: does this actually belong to me, or have I simply been holding it so long it feels like it does? A man is standing waist deep in a river. Not a calm river, a flood, carrying everything with it: uprooted trees, loose earth, the debris of things that used to belong somewhere stable. The water presses against his chest with the patient, indifferent force of something that was moving long before he arrived and will continue long after he leaves. The Buddha watches from the bank. He calls across the water with a question that sounds almost too plain for the situation. How do you cross? The man tries fighting first, arms driving hard against the current, legs pushing with everything he has, body angled forward in the way you hold yourself when you are absolutely determined not to be beaten. The river is unimpressed. The harder he pushes, the more ground he loses. It carries him sideways, then backward, and within minutes he is further from the far bank than when he started, exhausted in the particular way that comes from spending every resource you have on something that was never going to yield to force. So he stops. He plants his feet on the riverbed and becomes completely still, arms out for balance, expression set with a kind of grim resolve. He will not be swept away. He will wait here, unmoving, until the flood decides to subside. But a flood does not subside in an afternoon. The water rises slowly around him. His feet sink a little deeper with every passing minute. Standing perfectly still in a moving river is not a neutral position. It is its own kind of choice, and the river is beginning, very patiently, to reveal the consequences of that choice. The Buddha calls across again. Neither of those. Watch. He steps into the water himself, and what he does is neither fighting nor freezing. He reads the current, feels where it moves fastest, where it eddies and slows, where the riverbed beneath is firmer underfoot. He angles his body not against the flow but slightly with it, using the river's own momentum as part of what carries him forward, rather than a force to be defeated. He does not halt, because halting in moving water is not rest, it is the beginning of going under. He does not strain, because straining against a current stronger than any person is a way of spending everything you have and ending up no closer to the other side. He moves with the quiet intelligence of someone who has accepted that the water is stronger than he is and has decided, without drama or self-reproach, to work with that fact rather than against it. He reaches the far bank, not quickly, not without effort, not without being pushed off course more than once and needing to correct, but he reaches it. This exchange is recorded in the Samyutta Nikaya, the Connected Discourses, one of the oldest surviving collections of the Buddha's teachings in the Pali Canon. The Buddha's own words about how he crossed were 3 sentences. I crossed by not halting and not straining. When I halt, I sink. When I strain, I am swept away. 3 sentences that contain what longer and more complicated explanations of acceptance have rarely managed to do. They describe it exactly as it feels in the body, not just as it sounds as a concept. Acceptance is the most misunderstood word in Buddhist teaching. Hear it once, and the mind tends to translate it into something it is not: passivity, resignation, lying down in front of pain and inviting it to do whatever it pleases, into pretending that loss was fine, that the situation was acceptable, that the flood was not really so bad. This translation is wrong. Real acceptance, the kind the Buddha demonstrated by stepping into that water, requires more skill than fighting and more honesty than freezing, and it is not available to someone who has not first acknowledged the full reality of what they are standing in. It is not the comfortable option. It is the option that actually moves you forward. Fighting the current is the first wrong response and the most instinctive. It feels like integrity. It feels like taking the situation seriously. It feels like the only response available to someone who has not yet given up. But the Buddha's observation from that bank was simply factual. Strain against something stronger than you, and that thing wins, not because you are weak, but because that is what currents do. They outlast determination without any effort at all. This is not a verdict on you. It is just the nature of water. The second failure is quieter, and in many ways, harder to recognize in yourself. Halting feels like dignity. It feels like refusing to be swept somewhere you did not choose. From the outside, it can look like someone holding their ground. But there is a particular weight that settles into the body when grief has been held perfectly still for too long, when old pain has been frozen in place rather than allowed to move through, when fear has been locked into a fixed position in the chest and kept there, not because it has been resolved, but because allowing it to shift feels like admitting something you are not ready to admit. That accumulated heaviness is not the pain itself. It is what pain becomes when it has been refused any direction to travel. The third noble truth points directly at this. It does not promise that the flood will stop. It promises that the suffering we add by fighting the flood can cease. Not the loss, not the difficulty, not the grief that is the honest response to something genuinely hard, just the additional layer of suffering that comes from insisting reality should be different from what it is. That insistence is exhausting in a way that is easy to mistake for the pain itself. It is not. The pain is one thing. The argument with the pain is another, and only one of those is optional. Acceptance begins with a single quiet acknowledgement. This is happening. Not this is fine. Not this is how I would have chosen things to be. Not this is something I can resolve quickly and leave behind. Just, this is happening. The water is real, and here I am, standing inside it. That acknowledgement often arrives with something resembling grief, the grief of releasing the argument that at least gave you something to push against. But it is precisely in releasing that argument that clear sight returns. You stop spending your attention on a fight you cannot win, and discover suddenly that there is attention left over, enough to read the current, enough to find the angle, enough to actually move. The man who reached the far bank did not stop caring about where he was going. He did not decide that being cold and wet and pushed off course was secretly desirable. He simply stopped spending himself on the one response that was guaranteed not to work, and in that releasing, discovered the only question that had ever actually needed answering. Given that the river moves this way, which angle carries me forward? That question, quiet, practical, completely free of argument with the current, is precisely what acceptance makes possible. Not a perfect crossing, not a dry one, but a real one. He sits alone in a forest in the Gangetic Plain, sometime in the 5th century before the Common Era. No disciples yet, no monastery, no one to report to or perform for. Just a young ascetic and his mind and the patient company of trees. He has been sitting long enough that his body has stopped making demands, and now there is nothing between him and what his mind is actually doing. What it is doing, he discovers, is producing two entirely distinct streams of thought. Not chaotically, not randomly. Two clear directions, like two rivers running side by side that never quite merge. The first stream carries thoughts that pull, thoughts that want, that compare, that needle, and provoke, and return, no matter how many times they are passed over, to needle again. Thoughts with a particular texture, heavy, contracting, leaving a residue of unease, even when their specific content has faded. The second stream carries thoughts of a different quality entirely. Thoughts that clarify rather than complicate. Thoughts that, when followed, lead somewhere spacious rather than somewhere tight. He sits with both streams long enough to notice something that changes everything that comes after. The streams do not have equal force by nature. They have equal force only when fed equally. Every time he engages with a thought from the first stream, follows its logic, elaborates its grievance, accepts its premise, that stream grows louder. Every time he lets a thought from that stream arise without chasing it, it fades. Not immediately, and not without resistance, but it fades. And the second stream, given the attention freed up by not following the first, grows clearer, steadier, more available. He also notices something about the first stream that is harder to see but equally important. Feeding those thoughts does not satisfy them. A thought about resentment, followed and elaborated, does not resolve the resentment. It recruits more thoughts of the same kind until the mind is crowded with them. A thought about wanting, fed with attention, does not become quieter, it becomes louder and recruits its relatives. The thoughts from the first stream promise resolution if followed far enough. They never deliver. They only deepen the channel through which more of themselves will flow. This person will spend the next several decades teaching what he discovered that afternoon. And much later, already an old man, he will describe it this way: whatever a person frequently thinks and reflects upon, that will become the inclination of their mind. He is the Buddha, and this account comes directly from the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses, one of the oldest strata of Buddhist teaching in the Pali Canon. The discourse is called the Dvedhavitaka Sutta, the two kinds of thought. It is the Buddha describing in plain first-person language what he learned about the mind before he was the Buddha, which means it is not a teaching about perfect minds. It is a teaching that begins with the recognition that even an awakening mind produces both streams, and the question is never how to stop the first stream from arising. The question is only what you do when it does. Consider what this means for how you have been relating to your own thinking. Most people who are suffering from their thoughts are suffering not because the thoughts arise. Every human mind produces both streams, without exception, but because they have been taught, implicitly, to treat each thought as a verdict. A thought of inadequacy appears, and it is taken as evidence of inadequacy. A thought of dread appears, and it is treated as prophecy. A thought of self-reproach appears, and it is mistaken for self-knowledge. The thought is real, but the thought is not the truth about you. It is a movement in the mind, one of countless thousands of movements that pass through every day, and what gives it power over your life is exclusively the attention and belief you bring to it. The Buddha used a simile that lands with unusual precision. He compared the mind to a field and thoughts to cattle. In the last months of the dry season, a cowherd must watch his herd with real attention, not aggressive, not fearful, just steady and clear-eyed, because if he lets them wander into the standing crops, they will do damage that takes a long time to undo. He does not hate the cattle for wanting to wander. He does not punish them for their nature. He simply redirects them, again and again, with the patient consistency of someone who understands that this is what cattle do, and that understanding does not require drama. This is the whole of the four right efforts, which the Buddha taught as the practical mechanics of working with the mind. not fighting thought, not suppressing it, not punishing yourself for the first stream arising, because it will always arise, and the arising is not the problem. The problem is the unexamined habit of following it into the standing crops every single time. The cowherd's job is not to eliminate wandering. It is to redirect, to notice, without alarm, that the cattle have moved toward the crops, and to bring them back. That quiet noticing and redirecting, practiced consistently, without self-reproach when it needs to happen again 5 minutes later, is what gradually changes the shape of the mind. What changes is not that the first stream disappears. What changes is that its grip weakens. The channel it has been running in, worn deep by years of being followed without question, begins to fill in, and the second stream, the one that leads toward clarity, toward ease, toward a mind that can actually see a situation rather than just react to it, that channel deepens. Not through force, through attention, directed deliberately and repeatedly in a chosen direction. The Dhammapada opens with this exact observation. Mind is the forerunner of all actions. Speak or act with a troubled mind and suffering follows, as the wheel follows the hoof of an ox. Speak or act with a clear mind, and ease follows, like a shadow that never departs. Two paths, not chosen once and settled, chosen continuously, in small increments, in the ordinary moments of an ordinary day. Here is what this means in practice. When a thought about being insufficient arrives, you do not argue with it. Arguing is still following it into the crops. You do not praise it. You do not perform elaborate mental rituals to replace it with a more comfortable thought. You notice it. You recognize its texture. This is the first stream, pulling, and you do not pick up the rope. You let it sit there, which it will do loudly at first and then less loudly, and you bring your attention back to what is actually in front of you, not as a punishment to the thought, as a choice about where the cowherd stands. The young ascetic, sitting in that forest, did not yet know what he would become or what he would teach. He knew only what he had observed, that he had a choice about which stream to keep feeding, and that the consequences of that choice accumulated, quietly and without fanfare, into the texture of an entire life. The mind that had been fed primarily on the second stream, on thoughts that clarify, that release, that see clearly, became a different kind of instrument than the mind fed primarily on the first. Not a perfect instrument, not one that stopped producing both streams. One that had learned, through consistent and patient practice, which stream was worth following home. But knowing which stream to follow is only part of what makes peace impossible on certain days. There are mornings when you already know what helps, when you have already chosen the right direction, and something else is blocking the way entirely. Not confusion about what to do, something deeper than that. Something the Buddha identified not as a character flaw or a spiritual failing, but as a set of 5 specific conditions that cloud the mind the way different defects cloud a flame. He taught them not as a list to memorize, but as a map, so that when the light inside you goes dim, you can look at the lamp itself and understand exactly what is interfering. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Numerical Discourses, one of the oldest collections of Buddhist teaching, the Buddha described the undisturbed mind as a lamp burning steadily in a sealed room. Not blazing, not dramatic, simply present, clear, illuminating everything within its reach, without flicker or interference. That quality of mind is not a distant reward for years of perfect practice. It is the mind's natural condition when nothing is disturbing it. The hindrances are not things added to an otherwise neutral mind. They are disturbances to an otherwise clear one, which means the work is never about building peace from nothing. It is about recognizing what is currently in the way. The Buddha described 5 lamps, each burning with a different defect in its fuel, each producing a different quality of compromised light. He was not speaking abstractly. He was describing 5 states every human mind moves through, often within the same afternoon, that make clarity feel unavailable, no matter how sincerely it is sought. The first lamp burns oil that has been mixed with water. The flame exists. It is real. It produces some light, but it gutters and spits, struggling to sustain itself against what has been introduced into its fuel. The water does not extinguish it outright. It simply prevents it from burning clean. This is the mind under the influence of sensual desire, not only physical wanting, but the broader condition of a mind that cannot fully inhabit any moment because it is perpetually reaching toward a better one. The meal in front of you is real, but the mind is already on what comes after. The conversation you are in is real, but part of your attention is elsewhere, pulled towards something more comfortable, more stimulating, more resolved. Rest feels insufficient because you are resting towards something rather than simply in something. When this hindrance is present, the present moment feels thin, a poor substitute for the imagined moment just ahead, always just ahead, never quite arriving. The second lamp burns oil that has gone rancid. The flame is hot, and what it produces fills the room, not with warmth, but with something that makes you want to leave. This is aversion, not only the sharp heat of anger, though anger lives here, but all the cooler forms too: irritation, low-grade resentment, the hardening that happens in the chest when a person or situation refuses to be what you need it to be, the reflexive, not this, that runs beneath a difficult hour like an underground current. When aversion is active, the mind cannot see what it is turned against clearly. It sees the case it has already built, the verdict already rendered, the story assembled quickly and now defended with considerable energy. The rancid lamp throws real light. You can see things by it, but everything seen through it is slightly distorted, slightly harder, and uglier than it actually is. The third lamp burns oil left uncovered and clogged with debris, dust, ash, whatever the air has slowly deposited into it over time. The flame smothers itself from within. It does not go out in a dramatic gust. It simply dims, slowly and persistently, unable to draw cleanly on what should be sustaining it. This is sloth and torpor, the hindrance people recognize most reluctantly in themselves, because it so effectively mimics rest. Not the innocent tiredness of a body that simply needs sleep, the particular heaviness of a mind that has withdrawn from full engagement, sluggish, foggy, unable to bring any real quality of attention to what is directly in front of it. It arrives in the middle of conversations when you realize you have been physically present but mentally absent. It arrives during quiet moments as a muffled, cotton wool quality that makes everything feel slightly beyond reach. It is not stupidity. It is not laziness in the moral sense. It is a clogged lamp, and a clogged lamp does not need more oil. It needs to be cleaned. The fourth lamp burns oil being constantly stirred by wind. The flame is alive, perhaps the most visibly alive of all five, but it cannot find its form. It moves in every direction at once, throwing shadows that shift before they can be read, illuminating one corner and then another, without ever settling long enough to show anything completely. This is restlessness and worry, and it may be the most familiar hindrance to anyone listening to this right now. To anyone who has lain awake at 3 a.m. solving problems that cannot be solved at 3 a.m. To anyone whose mind, given even a small pocket of quiet, immediately fills it with movement. The wind stirring this lamp is the mind's own momentum, thought generating thought, concern spawning concern, one unfinished mental thread snagging on another until the whole interior is noise. Restlessness does not feel like a problem from the inside. From the inside, it feels like engagement, like diligence, like taking life seriously enough to keep working on it. It takes genuine stillness to see that the flame is not illuminating anything. It is simply moving. The fifth lamp burns oil clouded with sediment. The flame itself may be adequate, but the medium it shines through is murky, and so what the light produces is not clarity, but a diffuse and unreliable glow, shapes without edges, outlines without detail, the persistent sense of almost seeing something but not quite. This is doubt, not the healthy questioning that opens understanding, but the corrosive uncertainty that prevents any direction from being taken long enough to discover whether it actually works. It is the mind that researches instead of practicing, that reconsiders instead of proceeding, that asks one more time whether this is really the right path, just as the path was beginning to show results. Sediment does not destroy the oil. It suspends itself through it, making clear sight impossible without being obvious enough to identify easily, which is exactly how doubt operates. not loudly enough to be confronted directly, just persistently enough to prevent anything from fully landing. 5 lamps, 5 distinct qualities of compromised light. And here is what the Buddha's teaching asks you to do with this. Not eliminate these states, because they arise in every human mind without exception, and their arising is not a moral failure. But name them when they appear. That naming alone is not small. The moment you recognize that what you are experiencing is a rancid lamp rather than an accurate reading of reality, something shifts. Not because the aversion immediately disappears, but because you have stepped slightly outside it, enough to see it as a condition rather than a conclusion. Enough to stop treating what it shows you as truth. Enough to remember that underneath the compromised flame, the lamp itself is undamaged. The clear burning is still possible. It has simply been interrupted. The Buddha was not describing 5 permanent features of a broken mind. He was describing 5 weather patterns that pass through an essentially workable mind. Workable not because it is perfect, but because it is capable, in any given moment, of recognizing what is currently obscuring it. That recognition is where everything begins, not in the achieving of a state beyond disturbance. In the simple, repeatable, completely ordinary act of looking at the lamp and seeing clearly what is interfering with the light. Before dawn, in a village somewhere in the Ganges plain, a woman is already moving. The sky is the color of ash. The other houses are still dark. She has been awake since before the birds, because being awake before the birds is not a choice she makes. It is something that is made for her, by her owner, by the structure of a life she did not choose and cannot yet leave. She carries water. She has carried water every morning for as long as she can remember. The path to the river is worn into her feet the way certain griefs are worn into the chest. Not noticed anymore, just carried. Her name is Puna. And this particular morning, at the river's edge, she finds someone she did not expect. A woman is already there, sitting, still, in the particular way that suggests she has been sitting for some time and could continue indefinitely without effort. Her robe marks her as a Buddhist nun. Her face has the quality of someone who has, through long practice, stopped arguing with the morning. Her name is Dhammadinna, and she is one of the most accomplished practitioners of her generation. The texts describe her as foremost among those who can teach the Dhamma, which is to say, she has not only understood the teaching, but learned to transmit it in a way that actually reaches people. Puna sets down her water vessels. She looks at this woman who rises before dawn by choice, when Puna rises before dawn by compulsion, and asks the question that has formed itself in her chest without her quite knowing when it arrived. "You are free," she says. "Why do you still rise before dawn?" Dhammadinna is quiet for a moment. The river moves. The sky lightens by a degree too small to name. Then she says something that takes the question apart at its foundations. because freedom has its own thirst. What she means, and what she goes on to explain in the account preserved in the Therigatha of the Pali Canon, is this. The wanting does not stop simply because circumstances improve. The shape of the wanting changes. The object it attaches itself to changes. But the mechanism, the reaching, the leaning forward into a moment that has not yet arrived, that remains until it is seen clearly enough to be released at its root. Puna assumed that her suffering came from being a slave, that the thirst driving her life was external, imposed by someone else's ownership of her time. Dhammadinna is pointing at something more uncomfortable, that the same thirst running through Puna's compelled mornings was also running through the mornings of people who appeared, from the outside, to have everything Puna lacked. The Buddha identified this craving, this specific quality of thirst that never fully resolves, as the origin of suffering itself. And he was careful to describe not just one form of it, but three distinct directions it runs. Toward pleasure and sensation, the pull toward what feels good, toward becoming, the drive to be more, achieve more, arrive at a better version of circumstances or self, and toward escape, the opposite pull, away from what is uncomfortable, toward relief, toward the absence of what hurts. Three directions, one mechanism, the same thirst wearing different faces, depending on what the mind has decided it currently needs. Consider how this moves through a single ordinary day. In the morning, it presents as ambition, a perfectly reasonable orientation toward goals, toward growth, toward building something worthwhile. By the afternoon, it has shifted into comparison, the sudden awareness that someone else seems further along, more settled, more at ease than you feel. By the evening, it arrives as craving for relief, for the screen, the distraction, the thing that will quiet the noise of a day spent wanting things that did not fully arrive. Three different feelings, three different stories about what would help, one unexamined current running beneath all of them. And the current is not the wanting of specific things. It is the habit of wanting as a default relationship with experience, the background assumption that the present moment is insufficient and that what is needed is located somewhere slightly ahead. Puna listened to Dhammadinna at that river until the sun was fully up. What shifted in her was not the facts of her life. She was still a slave when the conversation ended, still bound to the same household and the same duties. What shifted was her understanding of where the real confinement lived. She had believed that freedom was a condition she would arrive at once the external situation changed. Dhammadinna showed her that a person can be externally free and internally driven by the same restless thirst. And conversely, a person can be externally constrained and internally discover a quality of stillness that the thirst cannot reach. The two things are not as connected as they appear from the outside. Puna eventually became a nun. Her verses are preserved in the Therigatha, the songs of the elder nuns, one of the oldest collections of poetry by women anywhere in the world. She is remembered not as someone who suffered and then escaped suffering, but as someone who looked directly at the mechanism of her suffering and understood it from the inside. That understanding, the texts say, was itself the liberation. Not a change in what the morning asked of her, a change in her relationship to the asking. The teaching asks something specific of you here. Not to stop wanting things. Wanting is alive in every human being, and pretending otherwise is a performance, not a practice. It asks you to become curious about the wanting itself, to notice when it is present, what direction it is currently running, what story it is telling you about what is missing. Because the thirst generates a story, always. A story about what would finally be enough, what arrival would finally bring the ease you are reaching for. And that story is almost always set in a future that stays just far enough ahead to remain convincing. Damadina rose before dawn because she had found something worth rising for. But what she had found was not a better object to be thirsty for. It was a way of being fully present in a morning that asked nothing of her except her full attention. The river was the same river Puna had been crossing every day, without ever quite arriving at its bank. Still water, still dawn, still the smell of wet earth and the sound of birds beginning. The difference between the two women at that moment was not circumstance or status or how much either of them had suffered. It was simply this: one of them was there, and the other was already somewhere else, reaching. Start with a question, not a comfortable one. When was the last time you felt genuinely grateful, not performed gratitude, not the polite acknowledgement of something good happening, not the relief that arrives when something bad does not happen, but the real thing? The kind that arrives without effort and makes the ordinary details of a moment feel unexpectedly precise and vivid and sufficient. The kind that asks nothing of what comes next, because what is here, right now, is already enough to fill the chest. For most people, that feeling is rare, and when it does arrive, it tends to be tethered to conditions, a specific piece of good news, a reunion, a moment when something feared did not come to pass. As soon as the conditions shift, the gratitude goes with them, which means it was never really gratitude at all. It was relief wearing gratitude's face. The Buddha made a distinction here that very few teachers have made clearly since. He said that two kinds of people are genuinely rare in the world. The first is the person who acts generously toward others without being asked. The second is the person who, having received something, care, kindness, support, the simple fact of another person's goodwill, actually recognizes it and carries that recognition forward. Not the person who says thank you. The person who sees what was given, understands what it cost, and allows that understanding to change something in how they move through the world afterward. This account comes directly from the Anguttara Nikaya, the numerical discourses of the Pali Canon. The Buddha called this quality katanyuta, but since we are not using Pali here, think of it simply as the act of truly seeing what you have received. He said, "People who do this are genuinely difficult to find, not because human beings are ungrateful by nature, but because the mind, without training, does not orient itself toward what it has. It orients itself toward what it lacks." There is a story in the same collection that shows this with the kind of plainness that makes you feel slightly caught out. A Brahmin farmer named Sujata owned 100 cattle. He knew each animal, their temperaments, their habits, the particular way each one moved through the early morning when he led them to pasture. One afternoon, returning from the fields, he counted and found 99. One calf had wandered. Without hesitation, he left the 99 where they were and went into the forest to find the missing one. He searched until dark. He searched with real urgency, calling, retracing paths, pushing through undergrowth that caught at his clothes. The missing calf occupied every part of his attention. It was the only animal in the herd that mattered, because it was the only one that was gone. He found it eventually, unhurt, tangled in a thicket not far from the main path. He freed it, returned to the pasture, and settled the herd for the night. It was only then, standing in the dark, with all 100 cattle breathing quietly around him, that something struck him. He had spent the entire afternoon in anguish over one calf. Not once during that same afternoon had he felt any particular sense of richness about the 99 that had never left. They had simply been there, unremarkable, uncounted in any emotional sense, invisible in the way that stable things tend to become invisible. The Buddha used this story to point at something that runs through every human life, without exception. The missing thing commands attention effortlessly. The present things, the ones that have stayed, the ones still standing, the ones that arrived and did not leave, require a deliberate turning of the head to see. Not because people are shallow or ungrateful in character, but because the mind is wired to treat problems as urgent and stability as background. A wound announces itself. Health is simply the absence of announcement. And so a person can spend years, decades even, so focused on what is missing that the 99 present things never receive a single afternoon of full attention. Gratitude in Buddhism is the practice of turning the head deliberately toward what is already there. Not to suppress awareness of the missing calf. The losses are real. The lacks are real. The pain of what is absent is not something to be talked away, but to resist the mind's default, which is to make the present things invisible through sheer familiarity. The relationship that has been steady for years, the body that carried you through yesterday without requiring your attention to do so, the small constancy of a morning, light arriving, air available, the ability to hear these words. These things will not announce themselves. They will wait in the background indefinitely, patient and uncomplaining, until either they are noticed or they are gone. Sujata stood in the dark with all 100 cattle and felt, for the first time that day, something close to wonder at what had been there the whole time he was searching. That feeling, arriving not from receiving something new, but from actually seeing something already present, is exactly the quality the Buddha was describing. It does not require a new situation. It requires a different quality of attention brought to the existing one. This is why the Buddha framed genuine gratitude as rare. Not because it demands extraordinary circumstances or exceptional character, but because it asks for something the untrained mind resists consistently: the willingness to be satisfied by what is already here, without the promise of more arriving soon. The mind that is always scanning for the missing calf will find one. There is always a missing calf. There is always something that wandered, something that is not yet resolved, something on the horizon that would make the picture complete. Gratitude is not the denial of those things. It is the refusal to let them consume the entire field of vision. The practice is simpler than it sounds and harder than it looks. At the end of any given day, before the mind begins its habitual accounting of what went wrong and what remains unfinished, it is possible to pause and count the 99, not as a ritual, not as a performance of positivity, as a genuine act of looking, slowly, with real attention, at what was present today that asked nothing of you in order to be there. What held, what arrived quietly and stayed, what you walked past all day without seeing because it was not missing. Sujata counted 100 cattle that night, and for the first time understood what he actually had. The calf had been gone for one afternoon. The herd had been whole for years. He had simply needed something to go missing before he could see what was there. The teaching asks whether it is possible to see it before that happens. "25 years. That is how long Ananda served the Buddha. Every day for 25 years, he was there, arranging the robe, remembering the teachings, walking slightly behind, managing the 1,000 practical details that allowed a teacher to keep teaching without being consumed by logistics. He knew the Buddha's pace when he was tired and when he was well. He knew which questions to deflect and which to bring forward. He knew, without being told, when silence was needed and when presence was enough. In the entire history of the early Buddhist community, no one spent more time in proximity to the Buddha than Ananda. No one knew him more completely as a human being rather than as a figure. So when the Buddha's final illness arrived, when it became clear that the body that had walked 50 years of dusty Indian roads was genuinely, irreversibly failing, it was Ananda who felt it most acutely. He stepped away from the gathering of monks and stood alone against a doorframe and wept. Not quietly, not with the composed sorrow of someone who has prepared for this. He wept the way a person weeps when something they love is being taken, and there is absolutely nothing to be done about it. A monk came to find him and brought him back to the Buddha. And what the Buddha said in that moment is recorded in the Udana, the inspired utterances, one of the oldest texts in the Pali Canon. He did not tell Ananda to stop crying. He did not instruct him in impermanence or remind him of the teachings on letting go. He said, "Enough, Ananda. Do not weep. Have I not told you that we must be separated from all that is dear to us? For a long time, Ananda, you have served the Tathagata with loving kindness in deed, word, and thought, always, without reserve. You have done well, Ananda. Keep on striving." Then he turned to the assembled monks and said something about Ananda that no one expected. He named him the greatest of all disciples in personal attendance, not despite the weeping, without qualifying it. The man standing outside a doorframe sobbing over the impending death of his teacher was, in the Buddha's own words, the foremost example of devoted service in the entire community. This account from the Udana contains a teaching that tends to get buried under more abstract versions of the same idea. Ananda loved the Buddha deeply, visibly, vulnerably, in a way that included grief and loss and the undisguised pain of separation. That love was not a problem to be corrected. It was not evidence of insufficient spiritual development. The Buddha honored it explicitly and publicly in his final days. What made Ananda's love pure was not its absence of feeling. It was something structural, something in how the love had been held across 25 years that had never collapsed into possession. Consider what Ananda had not done. He had never tried to limit the Buddha's movements, to keep him safer or closer. He had never withheld teachings from difficult questioners out of protectiveness. He had never made the relationship serve his own need for permanence by treating the Buddha as a fixed point that must remain fixed. He walked behind. He remembered. He arranged. He attended. And then he released, again and again, into whatever the teaching required next, wherever it needed to go, whoever it needed to reach. He loved with open hands. And when the moment of separation finally arrived, the grief that came was real and clean, the honest response of a full heart to genuine loss, not the catastrophic unraveling of someone whose identity had been constructed around the continued presence of another person. The difference between those two things is what the Buddha was pointing at. And it is a difference most people have never been shown clearly, because the culture surrounding love tends to treat intensity of attachment as evidence of depth of love. The more you need someone, the more you love them. The more their absence undoes you, the more they mattered. The more you arrange your life around their continued presence, the more real the love is. The Buddha spent 45 years teaching the opposite. That genuine love, the kind that actually serves the person you love rather than the comfort of having them stay, lives in the open hand, not the closed fist. Think about the relationships in your own life where love has curled into grip, where care has quietly become control, where the desire for another person to be well has slid, almost imperceptibly, into a need for them to be well in specific ways that leave you feeling secure. Where you love someone but also, underneath the love, require something from them, a particular response, a continued presence, a version of themselves that matches the version you have built your peace around. That requirement is not the love. It is the fear that arrived alongside the love and has been traveling with it ever since, quiet enough to be mistaken for the same thing. The grip tightens when we confuse these two, when we believe that releasing the requirement is the same as caring less. That holding loosely means holding cheaply. That a love without conditions is a love without substance. But watch what grip actually does to the things it holds. A hand closed too tightly around a living thing does not protect it. It restricts it. It shapes it to the dimensions of the fist rather than to its own nature. And eventually, inevitably, the living thing either escapes or stops being fully alive within the hold. This is not a metaphor the Buddha offered gently. It is a plain description of what attachment does to love over time. Ananda wept at the doorframe because the loss was real. But he returned to the room. He sat with the dying Buddha through the night. He attended the final hours with the same quality of presence he had brought to 25 years of ordinary mornings, fully there, asking nothing of the moment except to meet it as it was. That capacity to remain present inside loss, without trying to bargain the loss into a different shape, is what the open hand makes possible. The closed fist spends its energy fighting the fact of loss long before the loss has fully arrived. By the time the loss is undeniable, the fist has already exhausted itself and has nothing left with which to grieve cleanly or love completely. What the teaching asks is not the removal of feeling. It is not equanimity in the sense of emotional flatness. The Buddha did not praise Ananda for being unmoved. He praised him for 25 years of loving service given without reservation and without the quiet invoice that most love eventually produces. The invoice that says, "I have given this much. I am owed this much in return. I have stayed, so you must stay. I have loved you, so you must remain lovable in the ways I have come to depend upon." Ananda never handed that invoice across, which is why, when the Buddha named the greatest disciples in those final days, the man weeping outside the door was on the list. Love does not become less by being held more openly. It becomes more fully itself. It stops serving the function of keeping loss at bay and starts serving the person in front of you, meeting them where they actually are, rather than where you need them to be, following them into difficulty, rather than steering them away from it for your own comfort, remaining steady, not because nothing is shifting, but because your steadiness was never dependent on things staying still. Picture the scene. It is night somewhere in ancient India, and a group of bandits have a monk. They found him traveling alone. No companions, no protection, nothing worth taking in any material sense, but they have use for him anyway. The ritual they are preparing requires a human offering, and a solitary monk on an empty road is, for their purposes, a convenient find. They bind him. They build the fire. They sharpen what needs sharpening. They do all of this in full view of the man they intend to kill, in the way that people do when they have no particular reason to hide their intentions. The monk watches all of this without moving, not frozen, watching, with the quality of attention you bring to something that is genuinely interesting rather than something that is threatening your survival. His breathing is the breathing of a man who is resting. His face carries no particular expression. The fire grows and he observes it the way you might observe a fire on a cold evening, with something close to appreciation for the light it provides. The bandit leader stops what he is doing and looks at him properly for the first time. Something is wrong with this picture, and he cannot immediately identify what it is. He has done this before. He knows what fear looks like in a person who understands what is about to happen to them. He is not seeing it. He crosses the space between them and asks, with what sounds almost like genuine curiosity beneath the aggression, "Why are you not afraid?" The monk, his name is Adimutta, and his account of this night is preserved in the Therigatha, the Songs of the Elder Monks, one of the oldest surviving collections of first-person Buddhist testimony, considers the question as though it is actually worth considering. Then he gives an answer that the bandit leader was not remotely prepared for. He says, in the plain language of someone reporting a fact rather than making a speech, there is nothing in me that is gripping this life tightly enough for the threat of losing it to produce terror. The danger you are presenting is real. I can see it clearly. But the suffering that danger is supposed to generate, the dread of what comes next, the desperate mental scrambling for an exit, the anguish of imagining the moment of death over and over before it arrives, none of that has appeared. Because I stopped feeding the thing that generates it some time ago, and what you cannot feed cannot grow. The bandits release him, not because he persuaded them philosophically, because what they encountered in him made the entire premise of the situation feel suddenly incoherent. Their power over him depended on his suffering, the anticipation of what they intended to do. Without that anticipatory suffering, the leverage simply did not exist. Now sit with what is actually being described here. Adimutta was in genuine danger. That is not being minimized or spiritualized away. The first layer of difficulty, the real, external, undeniable fact of his situation, was fully present. What was absent was everything the mind typically constructs around a first layer of difficulty. The forecasting of horror, the replaying of how this situation came to be, and what different choices might have prevented it. The imagining of the moment of death in vivid, repeated detail before it had arrived. The grief about everything that would be lost. The terror of the unknown that waits on the other side. All of that is real suffering. All of it is self-generated. And in Adimutta, none of it was present, not because he was suppressing it, but because the practice he had cultivated had genuinely structurally removed the mechanism that produces it. This is the teaching the Buddha returned to across decades of conversation with people in pain. Life delivers difficulty. This was never in question and was never promised to be otherwise. A body gets sick. Something you built carefully falls apart. Someone you love moves away from you in some direction you cannot follow. These arrivals are real, and their weight is real, and nothing in Buddhist teaching asks you to pretend otherwise. But then the mind begins its additions, and the additions are where most of the actual suffering lives. The additions arrive quickly, and they sound like thinking. They sound like you processing what happened. But processing and adding are different activities. Processing moves. It looks at what is present, understands what it can, and releases what it cannot change. Adding circles. It returns to the same wound to press on it again, not because pressing produces anything useful, but because the mind in distress mistakes re-examination for progress. This should not have happened. I should have seen it coming. Something is fundamentally wrong with my life for this to be the case. Other people manage their equivalent difficulties without being this undone by them. I should be further along by now. Each of those sentences opens something fresh. Not the original difficulty, something new, built on top of it, borrowing the original difficulty's weight, while adding entirely new dimensions of suffering that the original event alone would never have generated. Adimutta had not arrived at his particular freedom by avoiding hard experiences. The Theragatha verses make clear that his path included precisely the kinds of difficulty that produce second layers in ordinary minds: loss, uncertainty, the grinding ordinariness of a practice that does not announce its progress. What he had learned through that long ordinary practice was the difference between the event and the story about the event. Between the difficulty and the verdict, the mind immediately wants to issue about what the difficulty means. Between the wound and the interpretation of the wound as evidence of something permanent and damning about the nature of his life. He had learned to let the first layer be exactly what it was: present, real, acknowledged, without automatically generating the second. This is available to you in smaller increments than Adhimutta's situation, and those smaller increments are where the practice actually lives. The next time something genuinely difficult arrives, and it will arrive because that is the nature of a life, try, just as an experiment, to stay with the first layer for a moment before the additions begin. This is what is happening. This is what I am feeling right now, in this moment, in this body. Not what it means, not what it predicts, not what it says about you, not what should have been done differently to prevent it. Just, this is here. This is real. I am here with it. That is already a different relationship to pain than most people ever find. And it is the beginning of the same thing Adimutta was pointing at from inside his genuinely dangerous night. Not the absence of difficulty, but the refusal to become the architect of your own second wound. He had been teaching for decades, village after village, city after city, the same patient offering of the same patient teaching to whoever arrived with genuine questions and whoever arrived looking for a fight. He had sat with kings and with people who had nothing. He had taught murderers and merchants and grieving mothers and monks who later betrayed everything he had given them. He had by any measure done the work. And then one rainy season, the monks of a particular monastery could not stop arguing. Not about trivial things, about the teaching itself, about rules of conduct, about who had the authority to interpret what and whether certain actions constituted violations of the training. The arguments had the particular bitterness of disputes between people who care deeply about the same things and have arrived at irreconcilable positions about what those things require. The Buddha intervened. He taught. He clarified. He offered the kind of patient, precise guidance that had moved genuinely stuck people before. The monks listened respectfully and then returned to their arguments. He tried again, the same. So he did something that the texts record with the matter-of-fact brevity of something that actually happened. He left. Not in anger, not with a declaration, not with any instruction about what the monks should do in his absence. He simply gathered his robe one morning and walked into the forest outside the town of Kosambi, and he kept walking until the sound of human argument was no longer audible, and then he kept walking further still. He stopped in a forest near a place called Parilayaka. He sat at the base of a sal tree. The forest settled around him the way forests do when whatever disturbed them has been still long enough. What happened next is recorded in the Udana, the inspired utterances among the oldest surviving accounts in the Pali Canon. An elephant came, not cautiously, with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a large animal that has decided something. It cleared the ground around where the Buddha sat. It carried water. When other animals came too close, it moved them gently away. It stood guard at night without being asked. It did all of this in complete silence, asking nothing in return, requiring no acknowledgement, generating no noise whatsoever around a man who had just spent months surrounded by noise. The Buddha later said of that rain's retreat that it was the most peaceful he had known. Not the most productive in terms of teaching, not the most significant in terms of doctrinal development. The most peaceful, the one where the quality of silence was what it needed to be. Hold that image for a moment. The person considered by the entire tradition to have achieved complete liberation from suffering, the person whose teaching forms the entire basis of everything being discussed across these hours, needed, at a particular point in his life, to walk away from a difficult human situation and sit quietly in a forest with an elephant for company. He did not transcend the difficulty of that community by remaining in it and radiating equanimity until the monks felt ashamed of themselves. He left, He rested. He let the forest do something for him that the monastery currently could not. This is one of the most quietly radical things in the entire early Buddhist record, and it tends to receive far less attention than it deserves. Because what it establishes, without argument or elaboration, is that difficulty is not evidence of insufficient practice. The presence of a hard situation in your life is not a signal that you have failed to understand something fundamental. The need for retreat, for silence, for the company of something that asks nothing of you. These are not signs of weakness in a person who should be further along. They are the honest response of any sensitive being to the actual texture of a life lived in contact with other people, with change, with the grinding, ordinary difficulty of conditioned existence. The first of the Buddha's 4 observations about the nature of life, the one everything else builds on, is simply this: life, in its conditioned form, involves suffering. Not occasionally, not as a punishment for specific failures, not as a phase that spiritual development eventually moves you beyond, as a structural feature of existence that includes even an elephant's patient vigil in a quiet forest, and even the most peaceful rain's retreat the Buddha ever knew. The teaching is not that suffering should not be there. It is that suffering, clearly understood, does not have to be compounded by the belief that its presence means something has gone wrong. Most of the additional weight people carry around difficulty comes from precisely this belief: that a good life, properly constructed and diligently maintained, should not include this much pain, that the relationships that matter should not be this hard, that the body should not require this much attention and produce this much discomfort, that grief, when it arrives, should move through more quickly than it does, that anxiety, when it comes, is a malfunction rather than a recognizable feature of a mind that cares about things in a world where things change without asking permission. Each of these beliefs adds its own weight to whatever the original difficulty already weighs. The original difficulty is heavy enough on its own. The verdict that the difficulty should not be there is what makes it feel unbearable. The monks of Kosambi eventually stopped arguing. The accounts differ slightly on what shifted, but the community reconciled, traveled to find the Buddha in his forest, and asked him to return. He did. The teaching continued. The difficult people were still difficult, and the unresolved questions were still unresolved, and the human community was still a human community, with all the friction that produces. The forest retreat did not change any of that. It was not meant to. It gave him what the Udana simply calls peace, a period of genuine rest inside a life that included, as all lives do, situations that resisted resolution and people who generated more heat than light. There is something in that, for everyone carrying the extra weight of believing their difficulty is evidence of personal failure. The difficulty is not the evidence. It is just the difficulty, present, real, neither punishment nor lesson nor cosmic commentary on the quality of your choices. just what a conditioned life, lived honestly among other people and inside a body that ages and a world that changes, actually feels like from the inside. The elephant came because the forest had what the monastery did not. That is not a spiritual metaphor. It is a plain description of a person identifying what he needed and moving toward it without apology. Knowing the difference between the weight you are carrying and the extra weight you have added to it by deciding the carrying means something damning about you. That distinction, held clearly and returned to consistently, is among the most relieving things Buddhist teaching has to offer. The field has been worked since before dawn. You can see it in the man's hands, in the particular set of his shoulders, in the way he moves between the rows, with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times and expects to do it 10,000 more. Kasibharadvaja is a farmer, prosperous by the standards of his region, respected, self-sufficient, in the way that people who feed themselves from their own land tend to be self-sufficient. He has opinions about work, strong ones, the kind that have been sharpened by years of physical evidence, about what happens when effort is applied correctly and what happens when it is not. So when a wandering monk appears at the edge of his field during the ploughing festival, the one day of the year when the whole community turns out to break the first ground of the planting season, and this monk simply stands there, watching while everyone else works, Kasibharadvaja's opinion forms quickly. He walks over. He does not soften what he is about to say. "You eat," he tells the monk, "but you do not farm. You take food from people who produce it, while producing nothing yourself. I plow and I sow, and because of that I eat. You should do the same." The monk is the Buddha, and the exchange that follows is preserved in the Sutta Nipata, one of the oldest texts in the entire Pali canon, predating many of the more systematized teachings that came later. What makes the Buddha's response remarkable is not that it deflects the challenge. It accepts it completely. "I also plow," the Buddha tells him. "I also sow, and because of that, I eat." Kasibharadvaja looks at this man standing in front of him with no visible farming equipment, and the particular skepticism of someone who knows exactly what ploughing looks like. "I see no plough," he says. "I see no oxen. I see no seeds. Where is your farming?" The Buddha's answer comes in verses that the Sutta Nipata has preserved almost exactly as they were spoken. "Faith is my seed," he says. "Effort is the rain that falls on it. Wisdom is my plough and my yoke. Conscience is the handle that guides the plough's direction. The mind is the rope that holds everything together. Mindfulness is my plowshare and my goad. I tend this field carefully," he tells the farmer, "and what it produces is liberation from suffering. That harvest feeds everyone who needs it." Kasibharadvaja fills a bowl with rice and offers it. The challenge has become a meal. What this exchange contains, tucked inside what looks at first like a polite standoff between a farmer and a monk, is one of the most precise descriptions of the middle way in early Buddhist literature. Not the middle way as a concept balanced somewhere between two philosophical extremes. The middle way as a farmer understands farming. You prepare the ground, you plant the right seed, you water it correctly, you wait with the particular patience of someone who knows that forcing a seed to sprout faster than it is ready to sprout produces nothing except a damaged seed. Notice what the farmer's approach contains that the monk's listening needs. Kasibharadvaja does not stand at the edge of his field, sending the field encouraging thoughts about its potential. He plows. He gets the soil to the right condition through sustained physical effort. He chooses the right seed for the right ground. He times the planting to the season rather than to his preference. And then, crucially, he does not stand over the planted seeds, demanding that they demonstrate progress by a specific date. He tends what can be tended and trusts the process that cannot be hurried. Both parts are essential: the effort and the release, the doing and the waiting. A farmer who only forces gets exhausted ground that eventually refuses to produce. A farmer who only waits gets a field full of weeds where nothing was ever planted. The skill is in knowing which part of the work is yours and which part belongs to the season. Most people in difficulty are stuck in one of two places that feel like opposites but are actually neighbors. The first is forcing. This looks like effort and is often praised as effort. It is the approach that says, if things are not changing fast enough, the solution is more pressure, more striving, more control, more intervention in a process that is already moving, but not at the speed that anxiety requires. Forcing exhausts the person doing it without accelerating what they are trying to accelerate, because most of what matters in a life, healing, understanding, genuine change, the slow settling of something that has been disturbed, operates on its own schedule entirely. You can no more force a grief to finish by a particular Tuesday than Kasibharadvaja can force his crops up through the soil by sheer insistence. The crops are doing what crops do. The forcing only damages the ground. The second place is giving up, and this one is more subtle because it often arrives wearing the clothes of acceptance. It says, I have tried. The situation is what it is. There is nothing I can do. I will simply wait and see what happens. But waiting without tending is not acceptance. It is abandonment, dressed in patient language. The field still needs water. The weeds still need pulling. The work that is genuinely yours to do, the preparation, the attention, the daily choices about where to direct your effort, that work does not disappear because the outcome cannot be controlled. Giving up and forcing share the same root error, the belief that your relationship to the process is either total control or no control, with nothing workable in between. The middle way that the Buddha was describing to Kasibharadvaja is the workable space between those two errors. It is the farmer's actual practice stripped of any mysticism. Do what is yours to do, with whatever quality of attention you can bring to it today. Then release the outcome into the conditions that are not yours to control. Not reluctantly, not while secretly continuing to manage what you just said you were releasing, but genuinely, the way a farmer genuinely leaves the field at night and sleeps, trusting that the work he did today was sufficient for today, and that tomorrow will ask for tomorrow's work, and not also for tonight's. This requires something that is rarer than either effort or patience alone. It requires the discernment to know, in any given situation, which part of the work is currently yours, what can actually be affected by your attention right now, and what is currently in the hands of processes that your attention cannot accelerate or improve. A farmer learns this through seasons of getting it wrong in both directions, the season where he overworked the ground and the season where he underworked it, and arriving, eventually, at a practice that fits the actual nature of farming, rather than his anxiety about whether the harvest will come. Kasib Haradvaja filled that bowl because something in the Buddha's answer recognized his own experience from the inside. The monk was not describing a life without effort. He was describing effort applied to the right ground, in the right amount, at the right time, and then the particular freedom of a person who has done today's work and does not need to steal tomorrow's rest in order to feel that the ploughing counted. Somewhere in the Vajjian Republic, in a city called Vesali, a man named Mahali has been sitting with a question for longer than he can comfortably admit. He is a Likavi chieftain, educated, politically connected, someone accustomed to getting clear answers to direct questions. He is not accustomed to sitting with uncertainty. But this particular question has resisted every framework he has tried to press it into, and eventually it has brought him, as unresolved questions sometimes do, to the one teacher he has not yet tried. He sits before the Buddha and asks something that sounds almost too simple for the trouble it has caused him. He wants to know whether pleasant feelings are real, not in the philosophical sense. He has heard enough philosophy. In the practical sense, whether the joy that practitioners describe finding through this teaching is genuine joy, or a kind of resignation that has learned to call itself contentment, or something so rarefied and impersonal that an ordinary person living an ordinary life would not recognize it as happiness at all. The Buddha tells him yes, pleasant feelings exist in the practice, forms of joy that go beyond what ordinary pleasures produce. But then he draws a distinction that Mahali was not expecting, and it is this distinction that the Anguttara Nikaya preserves as the heart of the exchange. He describes two flames, not as a metaphor for different spiritual stages, as a description of two qualities of experience that are available right now to anyone, and that differ not in their brightness, but in what they depend on to keep burning. The first flame is fed by oil carried in from outside. The lamp is real. The light is real. On a calm evening, indoors, With reliable access to oil, it burns well and illuminates everything it needs to illuminate. There is nothing wrong with this lamp, but set it outside in the wind and it gutters. Run low on oil, and it dims. Remove the oil entirely, and it goes out. The flame is completely dependent on something outside itself for every moment of its burning. The second flame burns in a sealed room. The same calm light, the same warmth, the same capacity to illuminate what is within its reach. But nothing outside the room determines whether it continues. The wind exists and the flame does not feel it. The oil supply outside fluctuates and the flame does not register the fluctuation. It burns from something internal, on its own terms, at its own pace, answering to conditions that are wholly within the room. Mahali understood immediately. The question he had been carrying was not really about whether pleasant feelings exist. It was about which kind of lamp he had been trying to light. Consider what you have been using as fuel. Not critically, with honest curiosity, the way a person checks what is actually in the lamp before deciding why it keeps going out. Most people build their experience of joy on conditions. The condition of being appreciated by people whose opinion matters. The condition of projects arriving at the outcomes they were aimed at. The condition of the body feeling well. The finances feeling stable. The relationships feeling uncomplicated. The condition of the future looking promising enough that the present feels worth inhabiting fully. These conditions are not shameful to want. They are what most people were taught, implicitly, to treat as the sources of a good life. The problem is not that they produce no light. They produce real light. The problem is that every one of them is oil carried in from outside, which means every one of them is subject to the wind. And the wind comes. It always comes. The appreciation becomes criticism, or simply stops arriving. The project lands somewhere other than where it was aimed. The body makes demands that reorganize everything around them. The relationship shifts in ways that were not anticipated and cannot be reversed. Each time this happens, the flame that was burning on those conditions either gutters or goes out entirely, and the person whose warmth depended on it is left in a particular cold that feels, in the moment, like evidence that happiness was never really available to them. It was available. It was simply stored in the wrong place. The Buddha was not telling Mahali that external conditions do not matter, or that a person should cultivate indifference to outcomes, relationships, and the quality of their circumstances. He was pointing at something more specific, that there is a quality of joy available whose source is not located in any of those things, and that most people never find it because they are so continuously occupied with tending the lamps that depend on outside oil that they never discover the room where a flame can burn without wind. What is in that room? The Anguttara Nikaya passage does not give a complicated answer. It points at the quality of awareness itself, the fact of being present, awake, and in contact with experience as it actually is, rather than as a ledger of what is going well and what is going badly. A mind that is genuinely here, not rehearsing the past or negotiating with the future, but actually inhabiting the texture of this moment, encounters a quality of aliveness that does not require specific conditions to be present. The morning is the morning. The breath is the breath. The fact of being conscious and alive in a world that is genuinely interesting if you are genuinely looking at it, that is a flame that no external weather can reach because it does not depend on the weather being favorable. It depends only on the quality of attention brought to whatever is actually here. This sounds simpler than it is to practice and more difficult than it is to understand. Understanding it takes about as long as it took Mahali to hear the two flames described. Practicing it, building the sealed room, finding the flame inside it, learning to return to it when the outside lamps have guttered again, that is the actual work. And it is work that cannot be done once and considered finished. It is work that is done in small increments, in ordinary moments, every time you notice that your experience of the present has become entirely dependent on a set of conditions being met, and choose, just once, to look for something that is already here regardless of whether the conditions are met. Mahali left that conversation carrying something he had not arrived with. Not an answer that resolved his question into certainty. A direction, a specific, locatable direction that was not outside himself and therefore could not be taken from him by any change in what his life produced next. The joy he had been looking for was real. It had simply been waiting in the sealed room while he kept going outside to check on the weather. The boy is about 7 years old. He has grown up in a monastery, which means he has grown up surrounded by people who are trying very hard to become something calmer, clearer, more awake, more free. He has watched this effort his entire short life. He has absorbed, without being taught it directly, the idea that progress is something you can see and measure and judge. His name is Rahula, and he is the Buddha's son, conceived before the man who would become the Buddha walked away from his palace and his life and the woman he loved to find something that would not leave him the way everything else had. Rahula did not choose to grow up in a monastery. That was chosen for him, the way most of the significant conditions of a childhood are. One afternoon, his father comes to find him, not to teach formally, to do something with a bowl of water and a child's full attention that a formal teaching could not accomplish by itself. He pours water into the bowl until it is almost full. He asks Rahula, "What do you see?" "Water," says the boy, "almost full." The Buddha pours most of the water out onto the ground. "What do you see now?" "Very little," says Rahula. "Almost nothing." The Buddha upends the bowl completely, empties every remaining drop, and sets it upside down on the earth. Then he speaks. "What remains," he tells the boy, "of a person who tells lies without remorse, who acts without conscience, and feels no discomfort in the acting, is like this bowl, not only empty, but inverted, unable to receive anything at all. But a person who tends their conduct carefully, who fills the bowl slowly and consistently through honest action and genuine attention, that person accumulates something real. Not quickly, not dramatically, the way a bowl fills, drop by drop, with patience, without urgency, without demanding that it be full before the next drop arrives. This exchange is from the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses of the Pali Canon. It was preserved as a teaching about conscience and right action, which is what it is. But it contains something else that applies directly to anyone who has been trying to heal something and finding that the trying itself seems to be in the way. A bowl fills drop by drop. This is not a poetic description of patience. It is an exact description of how certain kinds of inner change actually work, not through effort concentrated into a single dramatic push, but through small, consistent returns to the right orientation, accumulated over time, without any individual drop being large enough to measure. The bowl does not fill because you stare at it with sufficient intensity. It fills because you keep showing up with water. Most people who are trying to heal something approach it the way you might approach a project with a deadline. There is an implied finish line, a point at which the healing will be complete, the weight will be gone, the thing that happened will have been sufficiently processed and filed somewhere that it no longer has access to the present. They work toward this finish line with real effort, reading, reflecting, sitting with difficult feelings, doing the things that are supposed to help. And then they check the bowl, and the bowl looks roughly the same as it did before, and the gap between the effort expended and the visible progress made produces something that compounds the original difficulty, the conclusion that they are doing it wrong, or that they are somehow resistant to getting better, or that the wound is deeper than it should be, given what caused it. The original difficulty was already present. This conclusion is a second difficulty added to it. The bowl, already being filled slowly, is now also being picked up and examined so frequently that it keeps getting jostled and spilling what it has accumulated. The Buddha did not tell Rahula that the bowl fills instantly if the intention is pure enough. He did not suggest that the speed of filling is proportional to the quality of effort. He described a process that has its own pace, that responds to consistency rather than intensity, and that requires the person tending it to trust that water is accumulating even during the stretches when the level appears unchanged. Because that is actually what happens in a bowl you cannot see into clearly. Drops arrive. The level rises by amounts too small to perceive between one visit and the next. Then at some point, not announced, not scheduled, there is simply more in the bowl than there was before, and the accumulation of all those imperceptible drops is visible at once. The growth was not absent during the stretches, when nothing seemed to be changing. It was present and invisible, which is not the same as absent. Healing moves this way, not linearly, not on a timeline that respects what you have invested, not at a pace that corresponds to the severity of what happened or the sincerity of what you have brought to the recovery. It moves the way water moves into a bowl, according to its own nature, indifferent to urgency, accumulating in increments that cannot be individually perceived and can only be seen in retrospect when enough of them have gathered to be visible. And the most common thing that interferes with it is not insufficient effort. It is the repeated tipping of the bowl, the return, again and again, to the checking, the measuring, the comparison of where you are now to where you were told you would be by now, the disappointment that generates its own residue and has to be accumulated around alongside everything else. This does not mean doing nothing. The bowl does not fill if no one brings water. Rahula's father was not describing passivity dressed as patience. He was describing the farmer's wisdom applied to the inner life, the same wisdom that appeared when he stood in Kasibaradvaja's field and described faith as seed and effort as rain. You do what is yours to do today. You bring what water you have. You set the bowl down carefully afterward, instead of carrying it around with you, checking the level every half hour. And then you come back tomorrow and bring more water. Not because you can see the accumulation yet, because you understand, from the plain physics of bowls, that water brought consistently to a bowl held steadily will eventually fill it, regardless of whether any individual day's contribution was large enough to measure. There is a particular kind of suffering that belongs specifically to people who are trying hard to heal and cannot understand why the trying has not yet produced the healed state. It has the particular texture of effort turned against itself. The discipline that was supposed to help becoming a new source of self-judgment, when it does not produce visible results on schedule. The practice that was supposed to soften the chest, quietly hardening it in a different direction, toward the self that is not healing fast enough, not getting better efficiently enough, not demonstrating sufficient progress to justify the investment of all this trying. If you recognize that texture, the teaching embedded in a bowl of water and a 7-year-old's afternoon is addressed to you directly. Set the bowl down. Stop picking it up to check it. Bring your water tomorrow. The filling is not your job to manage. Your job is only to keep arriving with water and to hold the bowl steady enough that what has already accumulated does not spill. Rahula grew up and became a serious practitioner. The texts record his eventual liberation with the same matter-of-fact brevity they bring to everyone who completes the path. It happened. It took however long it took. The bowl filled drop by drop across years that included confusion and difficulty, and the particular complexity of being the child of a teacher whose attention was, by definition, divided among everyone equally. None of that was resolved quickly. All of it was held steadily. And one ordinary day, the bowl was full, not because something dramatic had finally occurred, but because enough drops had arrived consistently, enough, over, enough time, that the accumulation became undeniable. That is the only way a bowl fills. It was always going to be the only way. Start with a river, not a gentle one. A fast river in the middle of the monsoon season, carrying everything that the rain has loosened from the banks upstream. Branches, reeds, whole sections of riverbank that could not hold against the current. The water is brown and moving with the particular urgency of water that has somewhere to be. And in this river, there is a person trying to cross. Not swimming, grabbing every reed that floats past, every branch, every loose section of debris. The hand goes out and seizes it, not to use it to cross, just to hold it, to stop it from moving, to examine it, to form a position about it before the current insists on taking it downstream. The person is not crossing the river. The person is standing in the middle of a river, exhausting themselves, grabbing at everything that passes, and calling this engagement with the current. The bank on the other side is visible. The feet are still planted in the same spot. The Buddha used this image in a conversation recorded in the Samyutta Nikaya, the connected discourses, among the oldest surviving layers of Buddhist teaching. He was speaking with a wanderer named Kachana, who had arrived with the kind of question that sounds philosophical but is actually personal. Kachana wanted to know why the mind creates suffering even in the absence of genuinely terrible circumstances. Why a person can be safe, fed, surrounded by people who care for them, and still find the mind producing a quality of torment that the circumstances do not seem to justify. The Buddha's answer was not a doctrine. It was a description of a mechanism. The mind, he told Kachana, has a habit of seizing positions, of grabbing at whatever passes through it and immediately forming a fixed stance toward it. This exists. This does not exist. This is how things are. This is what this means about me and about the world, and about what is going to happen next. Each grabbed position creates a point of friction with the current. The current, which is life moving at its own pace, in its own direction, does not slow down to accommodate the grip. So the friction increases. The hands tire, the feet planted in one spot, while the river insists on moving, begin to sink. And the person who began by trying to understand the river ends up being slowly, persistently submerged by it, not because the river is hostile, but because grabbing at moving water is simply not a workable strategy for crossing it. Kachana understood the image, but pressed further. What does a person who is not grabbing look like? What does it feel like from the inside to stand in the same river without reaching for everything that passes? The Buddha described it this way. When a pleasant experience arises, the untrained person grabs it, seizes it, tries to extend it, forms the position that this pleasant thing is what should always be here, and then suffers when the current takes it anyway. When an unpleasant experience arises, the untrained person grabs that too, pushes against it, argues with it, forms the position that this unpleasant thing should not be here, and then suffers the friction of that argument with something that was going to pass, regardless. When a neutral experience arises, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, just the ordinary, unremarkable texture of a moment, the untrained person grabs at that too, but in a different direction, by not noticing it at all, by reaching past it towards something more interesting, treating the present moment as insufficient and looking upstream for something worth seizing. 3 different experiences. The same mechanism running through all 3. The same exhausted hands reaching for the same river. Now bring this into your own thinking, because this is where the teaching lands. A thought appears. Say, the thought that you have made a serious mistake in a significant area of your life. The thought is a reed floating past in the current. It arose because thoughts arise. They are generated continuously by a mind that is doing what minds do, producing material from everything it has experienced, and everything it fears, and everything it has been told about what a life is supposed to look like. The thoughts arising is not the problem. What happens in the next half second is the problem. The hand goes out, the thought is grabbed, and the moment it is grabbed, it stops being a reed floating past and becomes a fixed position. This thought is true. This thought is about me. This thought reveals something real and permanent about the quality of my choices and the trajectory of my life. The thought has been promoted from passing mental weather to verified fact about reality. And now the mind has to deal with the fact it has just created, has to argue with it, or defend against it, or find evidence for and against it, or generate additional thoughts that either confirm or challenge the original position. 5 minutes ago there was a reed in the water. Now there is a construction project, and the river is still moving, and the feet are still sinking, and the original reed is long gone downstream, while its replacement takes up permanent residence in the chest. The teaching Kachana received that day was not about achieving a state of thoughtlessness. The Buddha was not describing a mind that has no reeds. That is not a human mind, and the teaching was for human beings. He was describing the difference between a mind that watches the reeds pass and a mind that grabs at every one of them, and suggesting that this difference, which sounds small, produces entirely different qualities of experience over time. The river does not change. The reeds do not stop coming. The monsoon continues being the monsoon. What changes is the relationship of the person standing in the river to what is passing through it. Watching rather than grabbing does not mean indifference. It does not mean that thoughts about genuine difficulties should be dismissed as just thoughts. It means something more precise, that a thought's arising is not the same as a thought's being true, and that you are not obligated to seize every mental event that passes and construct a fixed position around it. Some reeds are worth examining. The farmer's instinct that something is wrong with the field, that is worth pausing for. The 3M conviction that your life is fundamentally broken and has been leading nowhere, that is a reed in a monsoon river, and what it needs is not examination, but space to continue downstream. The discernment between those two is what develops through practice, not perfectly, progressively. You are not your thoughts. This is the axis the entire exchange between the Buddha and Kachana turns on, and it sounds like a phrase until you experience it directly, at which point it stops sounding like a phrase and starts feeling like a door opening. The thoughts arise in you. They pass through you. They use the material of your history and your fears and your hopes to construct themselves, which is why they sound so convincingly like you and feel so convincingly like truth. But you are the river, not the debris the river carries. The river does not become a branch when a branch passes through it. The river does not become a reed when a reed floats by. It remains what it is, moving, present, continuous, while things arise in it and pass through it and are carried downstream to wherever the current takes them. Kachana left that conversation, and the texts do not record what happened to him afterward. But the image he was given has survived intact for 2,500 years, which suggests it describes something real enough that the people who received it found it worth preserving carefully. A fast river in monsoon, a person learning, slowly, to stand in the current without grabbing, not because the current becomes gentler, not because the reeds stop coming, but because the exhaustion of grabbing at everything that passes eventually becomes more visible than the relief it pretends to offer, and in that seeing, the hands open and the river reveals itself as something that was always possible to simply stand in. You have been standing in the river this entire time, not watching it from a safe distance. In it, feet on the riverbed, current moving around you, the whole weight of a life that includes difficulty pressing against you with its patient, indifferent force. And you are still here. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything offered across these hours pointed at the same recognition from a different direction. The hare in the forest was running from a story. Tissa found the present moment in cold water and wet cloth. The king at Abari's grave was carrying a weight that was never built to last. The flood does not yield to force and does not reward standing still. The bowl fills drop by drop whether or not anyone is watching. Adimutta sat quietly while the bandits prepared their fire, and the fire was real, and his peace was also real, and both things were true at the same time. This is what the teaching has always been pointing at. Not a life without current, a different relationship to the current that is already here. Nothing about your circumstances needed to change tonight for something in you to have shifted. The river is the same river, but you have been shown something about standing in it that you did not have before you arrived. Get some rest. Bring your water tomorrow.